One of the major misconceptions that we often hear, or that people often have when it comes to figuring out how much home they can afford, is they often think that whatever they're paying in rent, that is what they could automatically afford in a mortgage, right? So if my rent is $1,800 a month, the immediately thought for most people is, oh, well, I can afford an $1,800 a month home, or that's how much I can afford for a mortgage. And it is not an apples to apples comparison, right? There's a lot of things that go into that or factor into that mortgage payment. So you can't just play around with a mortgage calculator and say, okay, whatever equals $1,800, that's what I qualify for and I'm good to go. There's a lot of other things that come into mind. So like I said, we'll break. Welcome to the Home Goals Podcast, the ultimate guide for turning your home goals into a reality. I'm your host, Derek Thornton. Join us as we navigate the twists and turns of obtaining a home. We'll be offering expert tips, helping you avoid pitfalls, and championing your journey towards that cherished place to call home. In this week's episode, we'll be discussing one of the most common questions that we typically receive from home buyers or people who are interested in purchasing their first home, and that is, how much home can I afford? It's a loaded question. It's a definition of a loaded question because there are so many different variables that play into that. It's never a cut and dry answer. And so I wanted to take some time not only to address things that you should consider when you're trying to determine how much home you can afford, but also break down how the pricing works for a mortgage payment versus the cost of the house, how that compares to what you would typically pay in a rent payment. We'll discuss all of that in great detail and kind of going through some examples as well to give you an idea so that you can start to kind of take all of this in. I know for myself, anytime I'm looking to make a big purchase and trying to figure out how this matches or fits in with my budget, there's always a lot of research and things that I'm doing. And so I'm going to kind of help to direct you. I don't always claim to be the expert when it comes to the whole lending and mortgage and financial side of things, but I can at least give you some questions that you may not have thought of and help you determine or figure out a better way to kind of set this up so that you're in the best position possible. And so one of the major misconceptions that we often hear, or that people often have when it comes to figuring out how much home they can afford, is they often think that whatever they're paying in rent, that is what they can automatically afford in a mortgage, right? So if my rent is $1,800 a month, the immediately thought for most people is, oh, well, I can afford an $1,800 a month home, or that's how much I can afford for a mortgage. And it is not an apples to apples comparison, right? There's a lot of things that go into that or factor into that mortgage payment. So you can't just play around with a mortgage calculator and say, okay, whatever equals $1,800, that's what I qualify for and I'm good to go. There's a lot of other things that come into mind. So like I said, we'll break down the mortgage payment or the typical mortgage payment first, and then talk about some of the key factors that lenders take into consideration when they're determining how much home that you can actually afford. So the first thing I want to do is I want to break down a traditional mortgage payment, right? Even if you're renting somewhere, if you're doing a residential rental, you're likely paying somebody else's mortgage, right? And so this factors into their finances and the way that things are split up for them. But anytime there's a mortgage involved, more times than not, it's going to be set up this way. And so I'm going to first explain how that works before we kind of talk about everything else with the traditional payments and stuff. And so the average or traditional mortgage usually takes into consideration four different factors. There are four different pieces or parts of a pie. If you think of it as a large circle, a large pie, there's four different pieces that payment every single month is going towards. And the acronym is PITI. Again, that's PITI. That stands for principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. Now, there's other things that are typically factored in when it comes to your mortgage payment, but those are the four main ones that are almost always going to be involved in most situations. Now, again, every mortgage is a little bit different in some ways, but more times than not, you're typically going to be dealing with that. So again, that's principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. Those are four areas where your mortgage payment is typically going to be split up. Principal is the one that you like the most, right? That's the one that is the biggest advantage to owning a home. That's the one that goes towards reducing the amount that you owe on the home. right? So that principal is paying down whatever balance you have on the mortgage, and obviously whatever difference you have in what the home is worth versus what the mortgage is, that is your equity, right? That's the best advantage to owning a home. And so that principal is your best friend, right? That principal payment, or the portion of it that's going towards principal, is paying down your mortgage, which is in turn helping you. It's almost like essentially a forced savings plan, right? Where you're essentially putting that money or tucking that money away, and that's slowly reducing that mortgage balance and building you up more equity, right? So that's the one you love, right? That principal. The second one, interest, that is in reference to the bank's mortgage interest, right? So they are lending you several $100,000 in many cases, and they're not doing that just out of the kindness of their heart. They want to have some type of benefit that they're getting back, or funds that they get back for lending you that money for the home. And so the majority of your mortgage payment every single month is going towards the bank's interest, right? And so whatever that payment is determines how much of it is going towards that. Whatever the rates are that day determines how much of that is going towards the bank and how much is going towards paying down your principal. And also another important thing to keep in mind is that the bank knows the average person is usually going to stay in that home about 5 to 7 years, right? So they know that they traditionally have 15 or 30-year mortgages. Average person isn't going to be staying in the home that long, especially for like a 30-year mortgage. Long gone are the days of our grandparents and people who used to stay in houses throughout our entire lifetimes. That really happens. People are much more mobile now, and you see them moving a lot more. And like I said, the traditional time is about 5 to 7 years. And so the bank knows, even though this mortgage is set up for 30 years, it's not likely they're going to stay in the house this time. And we want to get the bulk of our money on the front end, right? And so what they do is they have it kind of on a sliding scale. If you have what's called a fixed rate mortgage, that means that your interest rate on that life of that loan for all 30 years, the interest rate stays the same, right? And so the principal amount and the interest amount stay the exact same throughout that entire loan. That will never change. Now, the other parts of your mortgage can change. And so I always am careful never to tell someone or never have someone think that just because you have a fixed rate mortgage that your mortgage payment is always going to be the same years down the road. Your mortgage will absolutely change. There's all other factors and economic conditions that can come in and change or impact that payment. But the principal and interest, those stay the same throughout the entire life of the loan. And the way they set it up is because they know, again, you're not likely to stay in that house past the first 5 to 7 years. They have it on a sliding scale. And so when you first move in the house, the majority of your principal or principal and interest, the majority of it is going towards the bank's interest. And there's a small portion reserved going towards your principal. And those two numbers slowly start to change positions over time. With the principal, you might see in the following year, it might go down a little bit. And so I'll show you later on. We'll do an example in this podcast that shows how those two numbers start to switch. But again, principal and interest, those are the first two parts of your mortgage payment. So again, if you have a pie, again, two pieces, the bulk of that pie is going towards the bank's interest. Then you have a small sliver that's going towards paying down your mortgage balance. And then the last two in that PITI acronym, taxes and insurance. So taxes, the property taxes, and then you also have homeowners insurance as well. The taxes you have to pay. You know, we always say those two things that are guaranteed in life, death and taxes. You have to pay those taxes on the house, regardless of whether or not you have a mortgage on the home. There's always going to be taxes to pay. And so that's something that you just can't get around. That's always going to be there. On average, most counties or areas usually will reassess the property values about every 4 years, max of 8 before they finally definitely change those numbers or whatever. And then again, you might see those property tax numbers shift more times than not. They're usually going to be shifting up, which means that you might see a slight increase in your taxes. The biggest increase that people have seen in taxes has been the one that happened most recently, and it's still happening right now because, again, the market exploded in 2021. And so the home values shot up so dramatically high that the unfortunate consequence of that is that also property tax values are going to be shooting up as well. And so the property tax is typically wrapped into your mortgage. The bank, because they technically own the house, right? Even though you are the one who purchased it and it's your name on the deed, because they loaned you such a large sum of money for that house, they have what's called a lien on that home. And so if you don't make those payments, that bank can take the house back, right? And so it's technically their investment, it's their asset that they're allowing you to live in. And like I said, kind of make payments to slowly begin to pay it off. They don't want the county to be able to come in and say, hey, this person didn't pay their taxes. And so more times than not, what they will typically do is they will force you to have an escrow account where you are putting a little bit of your mortgage payment in to an account each month, and then they pay it for you at the end of the year. They want to make sure you never get behind on that. And so they always have that portion set aside out of your payment. And so whatever your tax bill is, they're going to take 1/12 of that and put it into each mortgage payment. And so again, think of that pie. The majority of the pie is going towards the bank's interest. A small portion is going towards paying off the principal, and a small portion is going towards paying the taxes. And then lastly, you have another remaining portion that goes towards homeowners insurance. Homeowners insurance is not a requirement necessarily, but if you have a mortgage, again, that's their asset. They want to make sure their asset is protected. And so they're going to require you to have homeowners insurance in place in case anything catastrophic happens. Their asset is protected. So homeowners insurance can vary greatly depending on the area, the conditions. Where is it? By the beach? Is it on solid land? Is it in the mountains? Where is it? Like I said, what kind of conditions are present, and how likely are they going to have to cover a claim on that particular property or that home? And so homeowners insurance is going to be another thing where, again, they're going to take the annual premium amount divided by 12 and then take a portion of your monthly mortgage payment towards that they have an escrow account, and they pay that out of the escrow account for you at the end of the year. Because again, they don't want any issues with the taxes. They don't want any issues with the insurance. This is still their investment that they're wanting to make sure is fully protected, and there's not going to be any issues down the road. And so again, the majority of your mortgage payment, part goes to principal, part goes to taxes, part goes to insurance, and part goes to the bank interest. PITI is the best way to remember that. Now, there's a couple of factors that aren't included in that which can really throw things out of whack, and that's where you want to pay attention to, and that is the PMI. That is called private mortgage insurance. If you're putting less than 20% down, if your down payment is less than 20%, they are going to require you to have what's called mortgage insurance, right? Because they, again, know that you're not as likely to stay in that home for a long amount of time to kind of build up that equity. And they know you're a greater risk of having issues than someone who has a hefty down payment that's 20% or more. And so that is the threshold number that they set. And so if you do a 3% no down payment or 0% down payment or 5% down payment, 10, anything lower than 20, you are likely going to have mortgage insurance on that home. There are some loan products that I believe it's FHA is one of them as well, that have that PMI that stays on there for the life of the loan. And there are other loan products, usually more conventional ones, where you can have the PMI removed. That's what I did on my own personal residence, where we purchased it and we had, I believe it was a 3% down payment. And after 2 years, the values had risen enough and we had paid down our mortgage enough that the equity in the home was greater than that threshold as far as the 20%. And so the loan to value ratio is what they call it. Once that gets to a certain number, whatever, you have at least 20% equity in that home, then you may be eligible to have PMI removed. So we went through that process and we were able to get the PMI removed. But again, that's another factor that's going to be included, and that could be pretty expensive or hefty as well. And then HOA dues, if you're moving into a neighborhood, again, the majority of the neighborhoods nowadays, especially the new ones that are being built, almost all of them are going to have some type of an HOA in place. And so, again, that could be a huge factor that could weigh heavily, right? If it's a single family home, it might be a little bit less But if you got like a townhouse or a condo or something where the HOA takes care of a lot of stuff, that HOA due on a monthly basis can really impact your affordability, right? And so those are all things that you need to take into consideration. And a lot of times when people are looking at a mortgage calculator, they may just pay attention to the principal and interest and forget about property taxes, insurance, HOA dues, all those other factors that can play a very serious role in what you can afford from month to month. And so that's how it's typically broken down. I did a little example just to show you all kind of how it is broken up. There was a house that was on the market this morning. It was $260. It's a townhouse. And I said, okay, let's pretend someone put 5% down payment and they got a 30-year loan at like 6.5% interest. Their principal and interest, again, remember PITI, their principal and interest every single month was $1,560, right? And so that's their principal and interest every single month. And they have what's called an amortization schedule where you can see what amount goes towards the bank interest and what amount goes towards paying down your mortgage balance. The bank interest in the first payment, the bank interest is $1,337. And so $1,337 of that $1,560 is going just to the bank, right? So again, they're taking a large chunk towards the bank interest, especially in those beginning years, because they know you're a lot likely to stay in that home all 30 years. They want to get the bulk of their money up front. The amount going towards the principal, $223. Month number 2, those numbers adjust by like $1, right? And so it's $1,336 going towards the bank, $224 going to you. And those numbers slowly start to change places to where once you get to like year 15, then you start to see a more equal balance, whatever. And then towards the end of the loan, like in the last year or so, that's when you finally start to see the bulk of it. Maybe like $1,400 of that $1,560 is going towards you and the principal, and maybe like $100 or $200 is going towards the bank's interest. And so that's the way that typically works, where you can see in real time all the amounts. And so to give you an idea, when I got my loan balance a few years ago, we started out with a loan balance of $258,000, and now it has gotten to a point where we have gotten it down within the past 3 years, about $17,000 or so in principal that has been paid off on that particular mortgage loan. And so again, it's been about $400 or so. And so the majority of our payments every single month, especially in these first few years, have been going towards the bank interest. And so those are things you definitely want to keep in mind. Next, you also want to focus on the debt obligation as well. And so again, this is also where I talk about there's a huge difference in renting versus mortgage and what you qualify for. When you're renting or when you're trying to qualify for a rental, they're mainly focused on what is your monthly income? Is it maybe 2-3 times more than whatever the rent is? And then also they want to know what your credit score is and do a background check. If those things all check out, you're usually more times than not going to be good. The mortgage, there's far more that goes into it. And one of the main things that they want to pay attention to is they're looking at, in addition to all those other things that they're looking at on the rental side, they're also looking at your debt to income ratio. That is DTI ratio, debt to income. They want to see all the debts that you have, right? Whether that's your car payment, your student loans, your credit cards. They want to see all your debts and figure out whether or not that going to impact what your affordability is for this particular home, right? And so they're going to take your gross monthly income. So let's pretend, for example, that your gross monthly income was like, I don't know, $6,000, right? And so they're going to say, okay, that is what we're working with on the gross side of things. There's only a certain amount of percentage of that we will allow you to have dedicated to debt payments. Now, this is just debt, so this isn't factoring in groceries, utilities, all the other things that you have to pay for in the course of a month. This is just things that are associated with debt or child support, alimony, any of those things. These are the things that they're factoring into this decision, right? And so if they say, for example, let's do the math real quick. I'll pull out a calculator now, right? So if they say your debt to income ratio can't exceed 40%, and you're making $6,000 gross every single month, that means that you have $2,400 that can be associated just for debt payments. And so let's say in this example that they are predicting that your mortgage payment is going to be around $1,800, right? So if we take that out of the 24, then that means you've got $600 left that can be allocated towards different debts. And so that has to be, so you have to look at all the debt payments. So like look at your car loan, if you have a student loan, personal loans, credit cards, whatever the monthly payments are on those remaining debts, that amount cannot exceed, in this example, $600, right? Because that's all you have left to have associated with that. They said the max percentage is 40% out of that $6,000 every single month. $600 would be all you have left, right? And so let's say if you have a car payment that's $300, and then you have a student loan payment that's $250, and then you got a credit card that's $100 a month. Well, now you've already exceeded your total max, whatever. So you have to figure out, okay, is there any way that we can work out these numbers or change them out or whatever? But there's always going to be a certain limit to what that is. And sometimes a lot of lenders, they'll let you take that DTI number all the way up to almost 50%, which I think is a little dangerous at that point, right? Just because a lender says that you qualify for this doesn't always necessarily mean that you need to go and push those numbers to the max. You should always try to keep your DTI ratio as low as possible. The lower the better, right? The lower it is, the more margin you have in your budget, and the less likely you are to be what we call house poor, right? Where you got the house you wanted and everything's great, but you're still now got so much money tied up in the debt payments that you can't afford to do anything but just sit at home and eat ramen noodles every weekend. We don't want you to be in that position, right? And so you want to make sure that you have that number or can get that number as low as possible. And you want to talk to a lender to figure out what exactly you need to do, right? And so that's one thing I would always say is that don't just guess and say, okay, well, I looked at all my debts and I'm assuming that these are the things that I need to change or these are the things I need to work on. And once I do that, then I'll be good to buy a home. Do not do that if you have not talked to a lender. I did a podcast episode earlier this year talking about my personal home story. Go back and listen to it when you get a chance, and you will hear firsthand why that is not always the best idea. I work in this business day in and day out, and even I was surprised or didn't really know the things that I necessarily needed to work on to get my loan right. And so again, it's always important for you before you get into the nuts and bolts of this or get into the weeds with these numbers, talk to a lender. They can tell you what things you need to work on, what things you need to focus on, what numbers you need to have associated with it so that you can be in the best position possible. But again, all the things that we have talked about today relate back to the same point, and that is never a simple answer when someone says, how much home can I afford? There's a lot of factors that go into it. There's a lot of different moving parts and things. So you really want to make sure that you are making an educated decision every step of the way, and that you have as much information as possible so that when you are ready to buy that home, you're not blindsided by any surprises or mistakes. And so I'm always here to be a resource for you, put you in the right connections, and make those introductions for you so that you can talk to the right people who can make sure that you have all your ducks in a row. But I hope that you take all that information to heart, understand it, and look for other ways to learn and make sure that you're always prepared. Have a wonderful day, and I'll talk to you all next week.